Just a quick note before we start this video. At the end of the video you will notice that my aircraft has critically low fuel. I had the option, or I thought I had the option set for automatic fuel tank switching. Apparently I didn't. Don't worry, this is not going to affect the tutorial, and it's only during the last 30 seconds, so a little bit amusing, so do stay tuned for all of that. I hope you enjoy the lesson. Hello and welcome to the Ground Up Advanced Flight Tutorials. Last time out we were wandering around an airport and we were learning about runway markings and airport signage, taxiway markings, the ILS critical area, the holding points, what all the markings on the runway meant, the center line, the threshold, the aiming point, the landing point, the distance markers, so on and so forth. And we also learned about lights and the lighting systems on an aircraft. What we're going to be doing in this episode, well, we're going to start putting some of what we learnt in episode 1, which was the 6-pack, and episode 2, which was the lighting and the taxiway markings, into use, because today we are going to be getting into the air, finally. And if you guys haven't seen episodes 1 and 2 and you're joining me just in episode 3, I do recommend you go watch episodes 1 and 2. And if you do really like these videos, whoever's watching this, please do consider supporting me on Patreon. That support would be massively appreciated. The $5 reward also gives you access to Discord, where as people request, I will be able to do more things, more tutorials, more examples, maybe presentations, things like that at a as high a level as I can, and answer your questions and go more in depth on a lot of things that maybe I can't go into depth or too much depth in these tutorials, because then I'd be doing, like, for example, spending 1 hour talking about the transponder, which we will be looking at in this episode as well in a very basic format. If not, subscribing, liking, stuff like that really also helps out, so I would really appreciate all of that. So that's done, that's out of the way. Let's get on with the syllabus for this episode. First of all, I'm going to say to you guys that you need to, for this episode, if you're following along, I want you to go to EGNX in your favorite flight sim, whether it's XPlane, Flight Sim World, or Prepared, FSX, whatever it is. I want you to go to EGNX, that's Echo Golf November X-Ray. We learned about the phonetic alphabet. I will be using that across the next however many tutorials there are. Then I want you to go to any gate, but I do prefer gate 8. I think we're at gate 8 over here. So if you want to come to gate 8, then you will essentially be in the same place that I am. So do that, and then we'll be able to go through this together. If you're just watching this without following along at the same time, then don't worry, you can just keep watching this, and you can do this from any airport you want. Right. Next thing you need to do, make sure before we start moving along, you've got your joystick, your controls working absolutely fine. So make sure they're not snapping too quickly. You don't want them to be like just suddenly pulling up, pulling down, pulling left, pulling right. So that seems to be fine for me. My rudders seem to be working fine. If I look down, my rudders seem to be working absolutely fine. That's all good, because we are going to be taking to the skies, so we need to check this. Also, make sure you've got trim settings set up. So if you don't have trim control set up, make sure you check it and make some sort of keyboard hotkey or something for your trim. That's trim up and trim down. You could use maybe a shift and another key, or if you've got it on a joystick or a yoke, you should have controls that you can assign to trim just there. We'll be looking at a bit at the trim before we get onto the runway, and we are going to be using the trim quite heavily in the latter part of this episode. Next up, we need to, before we move off, get our lights sorted. I spoke about the lights last time out, so we need to switch on our navigation light. We need to switch on our rotating beacon light whilst we're in this area. We need to make sure our pitot heat is switched on. I talked about that in the first episode a bit. So now that we're underway and we're good to go, we should have a red light flashing on the back, as you can see right there. And we do have 2 navigation lights on, which you can't see in the sunshine because obviously it's very bright. Here we go. We're going to release the parking brakes. We're going to actually have this in standby mode. See that? We've got off. We're now going to put this in standby mode. I will talk a bit about the modes that we're going to have for this very shortly, but we're not going to cover that in too much depth just yet. And I'm going to give it a little bit of power. Now make sure your aircraft, your Cessna or your Piper, is not going to take a lot of power. Don't floor it. Just use a little bit of power, and make sure you keep it nice and easy. as you go around. Don't worry about the turn coordinator right now. I know that that little bubble is everywhere. The reason it's everywhere is simply because we're on the ground. And we're going to turn, let's go left here. I can kill the power a bit. You may need to use your brakes to get the aircraft turning a bit better, depending on how fast you're going. Oops. That's better. And we're now going to take a right here. Remember I said we follow these taxiway markings. So we're going to follow them as best as we can. We're going to continue up, and there we go. You can see a taxiway ahead of us. We're on taxiway Quebec, and we're going to be turning, let's go, we're going to turn right onto Alpha. So we can go left and right. That's taxiway Alpha ahead of us. We're going to turn right. So there we go. So this is your first taxi. If you're following along, this is maybe the first time you've ever taxied. It's a very simple thing to do. You've just got to follow the markings and follow what air traffic control tells you. Normally we would have air traffic control here telling us where to go. So they would have been like taxi to runway, we're going to runway 27, so it'd be taxi to runway 27 via Quebec Alpha, and then that means we go all the way down. See, this one here is Sierra, the next one to the right is Tango, but we're going to go all the way down. Now we could turn off at Whiskey, we can turn left at Whiskey to get us onto the runway, or we can follow Alpha all the way down. Now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to follow Alpha all the way down, despite the common practice to be turning off at Whiskey for an aircraft like this. So we're just pottering along now. And whilst we're pottering along, I'm going to talk a little bit about that transponder down here. So your aircraft is going to have this transponder here, maybe an electronic one, maybe it'll have a display, or maybe it'll be like this. You can see that this is set to 7000. 7000 in Europe is a VFR code. In the UK, it's a general code. So the general code means that it may not be VFR in the UK, but it is just a general code when you're in uncontrolled airspace. Now, whilst we're in airspace right now, we're in restricted airspace. We're going to take off into restricted airspace. It would be, there's Whiskey by the way, it would be smart for us to get a squawk code that would be assigned by ATC. That's what would happen. However, because we don't have ATC, I'm just going for the general code, which is 7000. In America, you'd be squawking 1200. In Canada, it'd be 1200, and then once you get to a certain height, I think VFR squawk is 1400. But we're going to be squawking 7000 in the UK. So for all of you guys, remember, if you're in your own countries, if you're in America or in the Americas, it's going to be 1200. If you're in Europe, it's 7000. If you're in the UK, it's 7000. In Australia, I think it's 7000 as well. That's the ICAO code. So the ICAO code is that. And basically what a transponder does is it allows the air traffic control to see your aircraft via a secondary radar. So not primary radar. Primary radar is the blips and stuff. You know, when you think about radar, the little moving in the circle, you see a moving line that goes around a radius of a circle, and you hear that, the submarine blip blip. That's primary radar. That's taking a reflection off the skin of the aircraft. It can be fooled, it can be tricked, and it doesn't provide the best of information when it comes to things like altitude. We're going to stop here before the ILS critical area. There we go. We are now stopped. Might as well engage our parking brake. My parking brake is here. The Cessna parking brake should be right there. Right. So a little bit more about this. Like I said, we're going to be squawking 7000. And we're going to now go from standby, which is what we use on the ground normally at an airport. We're going to go to ALT, altitude. That's mode C. We've got different modes of transponders. We've got mode A, we've got mode C, and we've got mode S. This doesn't have a mode S transponder, not as far as I can see. Mode S is on jetliners and stuff like that. So a jetliner would have mode S, but this has mode C, which is going to give us position, speed, and altitude to the air traffic control. We're going to now switch on our strobe lights because we are going to go onto the runway. We're going to switch on our landing lights. So now we can look outside and you can see we've got all these things on. There's our landing light. Everything is on. It's like we are good to go. We're maybe just waiting for an aircraft to land. They'd be landing straight through along there. There's supposed to be fences around here everywhere, by the way. I've been here. I know what it's like. There's supposed to be fences. There's supposed to be another road there. This is actually quite a nice airport, and as you can see, something I talked about in the last episode, where you get to an end of a runway and it's only got one number on it. So we're on Alpha and we're going to be heading on to runway 27. That's the only way we can go from here, because as you can see, that's the blast pad and there's our threshold. Before we get onto runway 27, we don't need to know any more about the transponder just yet. Make sure you've got it squawked to 7,000. What we need to know is these three over here. We're going to have to learn a little bit about these three. We know the throttle. You go up, more power. You go down, less power. But we've got these two over here. We've got the mixture axis and the prop RPM. Now, what is the prop RPM? Now, this is a constant speed propeller. That doesn't mean it works at a constant speed. It's just called a constant speed because you can select the RPM. That's what it says here, prop RPM, the revolutions per minute of the propeller at any given altitude, any given situation, any given attitude. So you can set that. That's what this does here. Now, essentially, all this does is this changes the pitch of a propeller. Remember in the first lesson, I spoke about wings and how wings generate lift, and how changing the angle of attack of the wing, i.e. the pitch of your aircraft or adding in flaps or something like that, allows the wing to generate some amount of lift. Well, this is exactly the same. By changing the pitch of the propeller, that's what this is doing, you're changing the amount of lift it generates in sort of this axis here, which is thrust. So you're changing the amount of thrust. So you're changing the amount of thrust that it generates. Very, very simple. Now, for takeoff configurations, you're going to want this to be high up because you're trying to essentially, what you're trying to do is you're trying to give yourself a high RPM with a low pitch setting so you can crank up the power, get that lift going, and then as you get further up in the air, you want to increase your performance or something like that, you can bring this down, and that's going to change the pitch and you're going to get increased performance, fuel efficiency, so on and so forth. So it's nothing too special over here. It's nothing too special at all. So taking off, we're going to want that. Right, so that's how you get the maximum takeoff power. When you're cruising, you can make your engine more fuel efficient by doing something like that. So because it means that it's when it goes down like this, it makes it easier. It takes less torque to spin the propeller. So that means that your throttle can be reduced, which means it's spinning easier, which means you're using less fuel, so on and so forth. But it's still providing the same amount of thrust because you're up in the air and the wings are providing the lift, and you're all good. So that's basically this prop lever over here. Not in too much detail. There is more to how that works, you know, the pneumatics or the hydraulic systems and so on and so forth. But we're not going to be worrying too much about that. Next up, we have this one over here, the mixture. How does this affect the engine? Well, this is the fuel to air ratio. So the ideal ratio is, if I remember correctly from engineering, is it 15 to 1? I think it's 15 to 1. So you have 15 parts of air to 1 part of fuel per unit of whatever it is. So 15 kilograms of air to 1 kilogram of fuel, or whatever it is, 15 liters of air to 1 liter of fuel, you know, whatever your unit that you're using, it's 15 to 1 generally is around that ideal ratio. Now what will happen is that you want to run rich when you're taking off. The reason you want to run rich is because that will have a cooling effect on the engine. So it's going to have a cooling effect on the engine when you're running rich. However, it does mean you're using more fuel. So rich means that there's more fuel to the air. So it could be 15 to 2, 15 to 3, something like that. Lean means that there's more air to fuel. So when you lean the engine, you're trying to take in more air, or you're reducing the amount of fuel you use, so it improves fuel consumption. But when you're up in the air, this is how you get performance out of an aircraft, because when you're up in the air, there's less air, or the air density is lower, and you're flying faster, so you've got to adjust the amount of fuel that you're inputting to sort of match this sort of ideal ratio to get the best performance out of the aircraft. If you're up at 10,000 feet or so and your mixture's full rich, you're going to get nowhere near the performance that you're going to be getting when you have this correctly lined up. Now, we don't have to worry about this just yet, because we're not going to go over maybe 3,000 feet or 2,500 feet in this video. Yes, it will still require the mixture to maybe come down to about there, but we're not going to worry about that. Don't worry. If you're flying a Cessna, you're going to be looking at this. You're still going to have 3 levers, but they're sort of pull levers out of one of these panels. So you'll have a panel here where you can pull 1, 2, 3. You'll have them in the same colors. It'll be black, blue, and red. So don't worry, it's the exact same thing, just shown in a different way. When we come into land, of course, this is in a later episode, we're going to have to put this back to full rich, but we will be learning about that when we get to the other lessons. So like I said, again to quickly go through this changes the pitch of the propeller, which changes how much effort it requires to on the throttle to spin that propeller, and also changes the amount of lift that propeller is producing in the y-axis. So that would be in the x-axis, which would then be your thrust. This very simply changes the amount of fuel that goes into the engine. When it's rich, it's higher than your standard amount of fuel. So it's the 15:1 ratio, 15 parts air to 1 part fuel, no longer applies because there's more fuel going in. When it's lean, there is more than 15 parts of air going in for every 1 part of fuel, because you've dropped the fuel, so it saves fuel consumption. But on the downside, you can overheat your engine, you can foul the plugs, whatever. So we're going to have to learn about that as and when we go. I think that's pretty much everything you need to know about the aircraft so far. What we're going to do now is we're going to line up on the runway and actually get in the air for the latter part of this. So we've checked everything. Make sure this is all the way up. This is all the way up. All our lights are on. Our throttles are idle. We've got ourselves ready to go. We're now going to go forward. In fact, we also need to tune barometric pressure, but it should be okay, because if you've picked a clear day like I have, then you should have the barometric pressure being 29902 or 1013 hectopascals. Is it hectopascals? Yes, I think so. Or 1013 millibars, that's it, not hectopascals. That's another way of saying it. Right, so now we're going to line up on this runway. We want to line up pretty much in the center as you can get it. So we'll do this, and I'm just going to roll slightly forward up to the threshold marker, and then I'm going to stop about there. So I'm back down on idle power. I'm just letting the aircraft coast itself slowly and let the friction stop the aircraft. There we go. Okay, we're now going to lower one layer of flaps, or one level of flaps, in an ESP platform simulator. So FSX, prepared flight sim world, it's going to be F7. 1 F7, you'll hear that click. I'm not sure what it is in XPlane, but if you look over here, this is your flap lever if you're using this aircraft, and for the Cessna you'll have a little switch down here and it'll say flaps. You just want to knock that down one time to give yourself 1 notch of flaps, which if you look outside you can see right there. Okay, fantastic. Now, the way we're going to do this on the runway, we have to know about rotate speeds. For this aircraft, I think I'm going to let this go all the way up to maybe 75 knots before I rotate fully. I'm going to start rotating at about 70. What rotate means is smoothly pulling up on the stick. Not all the way, not like that. That's bad. You want to bring it up slowly. Yeah, nice and smooth. As you can see, the movement I'm doing on the yoke. Let me look down at the yoke. You can see that movement. I've not just pulled it back like that. That's yanking the stick back. We're going to move it back slowly and get that lift. And what that's doing at the back is, as you can see, that's lifting the elevator. And as it lifts the elevator, the airflow changes and lifts the aircraft into the air. So that's what we're going to do. That's pulling it back suddenly. That's a sudden pullback. That's bad. This is a gentle pullback. Nice and simple. We're not going to have to pull it back all the way either. So we're going to do that now. The aircraft may sway as you put the power down. It may sway to the left. The reason it does that is because of the way the propellers work and the airflow coming over the propeller. The torque out of that propeller, because of the way it's spinning, will veer your aircraft to the left. So what you need to do is you're going to have your rudder. You see the rudders? We're going to have rudder to the right, not so much to keep this aircraft on the center line. I also recommend, this is a good practice on jetliners and stuff, to keep your nose slightly forward. So you want to push down on the stick, on your yoke or on your flight stick, whatever. Just a little bit to keep the nose on the ground until a certain amount of knots. For this, really, it doesn't matter on an aircraft like this, but on a jetliner, up to 80 knots, you need to be able to do that. And that's when the airspeed comes alive. So on this, I'm probably going to do it a little bit just to make sure everything's okay and I don't start lifting off too early, but it shouldn't really be a problem. What we're going to do is we're going to get to our rotate speed, which on your aircraft may be different. On this aircraft, I'm trying to get it today to be about 70 knots. It may not be. The VR, the rotate speed, is the speed that you pull up on that stick. Then we're going to have a positive rate. I have a landing gear on this aircraft that is retractable, so I am going to call out positive rate, gear up, and then I'm going to put the gear up and you're going to be able to hear the gear. If you don't have a landing gear on your aircraft, don't worry about it. It's just positive rate. That's just showing that we have a positive rate on this vertical speed indicator. We are climbing, so we've rotated and we're coming off the ground and we're up in the air. Once we do that, I am going to try and get a climb at around 90 knots. Yep, around 90 knots, I am trying to get a climb of 500 foot per minute. So I am going to adjust the throttles and my control of the stick, and you need to do the same to maintain the 500. So you're going to use the stick to maintain the 500 foot per minute climb, and you're going to use the throttle to maintain the speed. Once we've got that, and don't worry if we're drifting left and right, don't worry about that. If we do drift left and right, just minor adjustments to the left and right to try and keep ourselves on track, but we're not really interested in that in this lesson. What we're interested in is trimming the aircraft to climb and then fly straight and level. So that's what we're going to do. So we're going to climb, make sure we get that 500 foot per minute rate of climb and the 90 degree. Once we're happy with that, we're then going to trim the aircraft using our trim controls to make sure that we can maintain that whilst letting go of the stick. So you can see I'm pulling back on the stick. I may be holding it like that for a while. Then once I've trimmed, slowly that stick's going to go back and then I'm going to be able to let go. Right now I've got no hands on the stick, and the aircraft will still climb at 500 foot per minute at 90. We won't have to adjust the throttle. We won't have to adjust the stick. We're not going to have to play around with the yoke or hold on to that, because it does get tiring. It will tire your arm out if you're holding onto a stick. That's why you have trim. It's too much effort for a pilot to constantly be doing that. So that's why we've got to do that. Plus, a pilot might want to have a chocolate or might want to be reading a map, planning your next maneuver. You don't want to be constantly holding onto a stick while rummaging around for a map. It's just not good. It's very, very bad. Plus, it puts strain on the hydraulic systems as well, or on the cables, because if you're constantly holding this in a position, going like this, that's constantly having a tension on the cable, and that could damage your cable. So there's lots of advantages to trimming an aircraft. Once we're up at about 2,000 feet or 2,500 feet, we're going to see if we can trim to maintain 2,500 feet. We'll start the trim process at around 2,350 and gently bring the aircraft in to reduce that vertical speed from 5 to 0 without us actually using this. We're going to do it all through the trim, and then we're just going to do this for minor adjustments, and then we'll learn a bit about how an aircraft flies with trim. Ready? Everyone good to go? Okay. Power up. Nice and slowly. So you can see me nice and slowly bringing the throttles up. Little bit of nose down, and you can see I'm already pulling to the left a little bit, so I'm going to rudder right as I bring the power all the way. There we go. 70 knots, start the rotate, and we're up and away. Right, positive rate, gear up. I'm also going to bring the flaps up any minute now, and flaps up. Right, now I need to make sure that I bring the power back. So we've got 500 foot per minute. There's the 500 foot per minute that I'm looking for, but I'm doing 100 knots. I'm going to slow the aircraft down. I'm going to see if I can maintain 2.7. Hopefully you guys are following along. There you go, the aircraft is now slowing. So I've dropped back on the throttle, that's all I've done here. There we go. And we're slowing down. I'm going to drop back on the throttle a little bit more. Seems happier there. That's down to 95 now. And it looks like we're down to 90. Just about there, it seems. There we go. We're down to 90. Now we need to make sure we can maintain that. So we're coming up to 1,000 feet. Our flaps are now in. Make sure you've brought your flaps in. And I'm going to increase the power ever so slightly to make sure that we can maintain that 90. That seems sort of alright. There we go. So now we've done that, you'll notice that I am pulling back on the stick, which is a little bit uncomfortable and awkward. You know, your hands are going to start hurting or your arms are going to start hurting. I'm also drifting, so I am going to correct very, very slightly for the wind. And the drift, of course, at being at high power. So I said we're going to be pulling to the left. We are still pulling to the left quite significantly. Right, now what we need to do is we're pulling back on the nose. So what we need to do is we need to trim nose up to ease what we're doing here. So we're going to trim nose up. And don't do this too suddenly. This can be very sensitive. We're going to do this gently. So we're still at the 500 and we're going to, step by step, I am increasing the trim for nose up. And as I'm doing that, I am bringing my stick down, as you can see. I'm almost there. You can see I'm at 400 foot per minute and I'm barely putting in any pressure now on the stick. So you're bringing it in step by step. We are drifting again, but that's okay. That's because of the crosswind. And there we go. I have now let go of the stick and we're doing 90 knots. I haven't touched the throttle anymore and we're climbing at 500 foot per minute or thereabouts. I can bring in that climb a little bit more. There you go. Look, I've let go of the stick. My hands are off. Look, I'm clapping. My hands are off the stick. And I am now climbing at a stable 500 foot per minute and 90 knots. And that's how simple trimming an aircraft is. Of course, as you go higher, your trim is going to cancel out a bit. It's going to fluctuate a bit. These aircraft aren't the best at staying trimmed. Autopilot systems naturally trim an aircraft more. But this is a great way to learn. And this is something that you can do on a lot of aircraft. This aircraft, for example, doesn't actually have any altitude hold. Of course it does in the simulator, but the real aircraft doesn't have any altitude hold. So there we go. We're now trimmed. So I am now just turning with the yoke, but I'm not pulling back on the yoke. So that allows me to maintain my course. 400 foot per minute, 500 foot per minute. We're good. Now we've got to 2,300. So what we're going to do now is we're going to start dropping that trim. So we're going to now nose down. If you've gone past 2,500, don't worry. Do it just before 3,000. So start at 2,800. And as you can see, my nose trim has now gone down. As I got to 2,400, I am now slowly dropping the nose trim. But watch the speed. The speed is now starting to increase because I haven't pulled back on the propeller. Or I haven't pulled back on the throttle, excuse me. But you can see now, as I get to 2,500, I have now hit the 0. Now what I have to be careful of is I can't just stop here. I have to maintain the trim. I have to continually trim this aircraft until the point at which it stabilizes on the speed, because the faster an aircraft goes, the more airflow over the wings, the more it wants to climb as we fly through this cloud in a wonderful manner. So as the aircraft increases speed to 100 knots, you can see it wants to keep climbing. So I am just slowly bringing that trim in, one step at a time. And as you can see, we've got to 100 knots. and I am still climbing ever so slightly, but for most of it, it seems to have stabilized on this aircraft. And again, I'm not pulling back on the stick. I am literally only turning the aircraft with the yoke. I am not actually doing anything else but turning the aircraft. I am not pulling back, I'm not pushing forward. My arms are free. There's no strain on my arm. I can now read things. I can pull out my phone. Obviously don't do this in a real aircraft, but I can look at my charts. I can do whatever I need to do. I can look at my, right now I'm recording, so I can look at my screen to make sure everything's recording correctly, so on and so forth. And there we go, we've nicely trimmed at 2,500 feet. So hopefully you guys have managed to do this. It should be quite possible for you guys. And don't worry if you haven't managed to do this the first time. Don't worry if your takeoff wasn't so smooth. That's okay. You know, if this is your absolute first time, it takes a little bit of practice, and you've just got to keep practicing this. Follow the same things I told you. Do the same thing over and over again. Take off, get a nice climb, trim for a climb, get to a certain height that you're happy with, and then trim it down nice and slowly to bring it to that height. Now, watch what I'm going to do. Now that we're pretty much stable on the trim, I am now going to do... Right, why is this doing this? I need to... There we go. I am now going to increase the power of the aircraft. I want to get to 3,000 feet. Now, the way I'm going to get to 3,000 feet is not by pulling up on the stick. No, why would I do that? That's going to slow the aircraft down. That's going to make it harder to fly. What I'm thinking of doing is I'm going to increase the power to the throttle. When I increase the power, I am then going to induce a lift on the aircraft, because the aircraft's going to speed up. When the aircraft speeds up, because it's been trimmed to stay level at this height and this speed, or particularly it's the speed that we're looking at, any faster is going to cause the aircraft to lift, just like it would on the ground, just like it does when you put the throttles up on the runway. Any slower will cause the aircraft to drop. And what we're going to experience here is a phygoid motion. So if we increase, I'm just going to momentarily increase the power until the aircraft speeds up a little bit, then I'm going to drop it again. And watch what happens. And I'm not going to do any manipulation of the stick apart from to keep the aircraft flying straight. I'm not going to be doing any manipulation to keep it level. So power up, just a little bit. And you notice the aircraft immediately tries to climb. And now power back to where it's supposed to be. So the aircraft climbs and it slows down. Watch the airspeed indicator. It slows down. As it slows down, the aircraft is now going to drop. We're at 2,620 feet. The aircraft is now going to start dropping because it got too slow. 100 was what it was trimmed for. As it gets back to 100, it now starts stabilizing itself. Now it stabilized itself at 2,600 feet or so. It's still climbing a little bit, and then it's going to drop the speed again. And you'll notice, there it goes, it's gone below 100, and you'll notice the VSI, the vertical speed indicator, is dropping below 0. It's stabilizing itself. This aircraft is inherently balanced now, so whatever you do to it, it will bring itself back into this position of 100 as long as you bring it to that same throttle position again. Now it's stabilized itself back at 100. Job done. Now watch what happens. I'm going to reduce power. The aircraft is going to pitch down, nose down. Just a little bit, not too much. And there goes the aircraft nose. You see it going down. And now I'm going to bring that power back to where it needs to be. And it's increased in speed. As the nose pitched down, it's increased in speed because of gravity. And now it goes, well, hang on, I've increased in speed, now I need to climb. But we're back to that same power setting, that same throttle setting. So it's going to climb, and it's going to slow down, and it's going to drop, and it's going to stable itself and level itself out at a general height. So it should level itself out at around 2,600 feet, right here. Now I'm letting the aircraft drift away from 270 a little bit. That's okay, we're not too worried about that just yet. What we're looking at here is this phygoid motion. It's phygoid, phugoid? No, phygoid. Figo in motion. There we go. So that's the motion of the aircraft going up and down, and gently each oscillation becomes more and more dampened until it levels itself out. So you can see it's climbing, it's dropped speed, it's dropping, and now it's pretty much leveled itself out. It's dropped a little bit, and there we go. Absolutely fantastic. Now, we can use this to our advantage to finish this off. Watch this. If I were to now go ahead and, well, first of all, I'm going to do a bit of rudder trimming. Don't worry about this. I'm just rudder trimming because this aircraft is pulling one way because of the wind. I'm going to increase the power of the aircraft. I want to bring this up to 3,000 feet. So if I increase the power, and I'm going to use the yoke now. I am going to use the yoke now, but I'm going to increase the power. Very gently to maintain a 500. Now I'm going to push down on the yoke to maintain that 500 foot per minute and try and keep the power, try and keep the 100 knots that we're going. So we're still at the 100 knots, still at the 100 knots, sped up a little bit. We're almost at 3,000 feet, and when we get to 3,000 feet, again, I'm going to reduce the power to the power setting we had before. Yes, don't worry about that. I told you the mixture will want to work out. There we go, power setting we had before, and I'm going to bring this down using my yoke back towards the 0 to cancel out that motion that we're going to have about it going up and down. We want to cancel that motion, and there we go. We've brought ourselves to 3,000. We've essentially got ourselves at 100 knots still. We didn't pick up any speed, even though we increased the power. We didn't pick up any speed, we kept it under control, and we're at 3,000 feet, new altitude, and we're still trimmed up. We may need to retrim slightly because we are at a different altitude. It does work slightly differently, but for the most part, it's trimmed in pretty well. So I've just adjusted the trim ever so slightly. I just gave that 2 clicks down. 2 clicks down, and we're at 100 knots, 3,020 feet. Simple. Similar. I'm going to reduce this, and this is where we'll end. I'm going to reduce the power. I'm going to reduce the power and let the nose drop. There we go. We're going back down to 2,500 feet. But I'm going to use my yoke to maintain 100 knots. Right, so I'm still trying to keep that 100 knots. We're going down, it's about 500 foot per minute. It seems to be very good for us. We're not increasing. We dropped slightly below 100 for a little while, but we're back up to 100 now. We just let that drop a little bit. There we go. We're keeping that 500 foot per minute rate of descent. And now, as we bring the yoke back up, so as we pull up on the yoke, to bring it to 2,500, we need to bring that power back into that power setting. The same power setting we had before. So we'll bring the power up. And bring the nose up. There we go. And retrim ever so slightly. And we've managed it. 100 knots still. And we're trimmed. And we're at about 2,500 feet. And again, I'm not pulling back on the yoke anymore. In fact, we're a little bit faster than 100. That's why we've got this little bit of oscillation going on. But there we go. We can always retrim to correct for that. And trim for a new speed. So we can trim for 105 knots instead now. But there we go. That's essentially it. That's how you fly an aircraft and trim it for different altitudes, different speeds. Everything is running absolutely fine here. So now we're at 105 knots. We're climbing very slowly. I can just trim this up. There we go. So now we can handle 105 knots and not climb and still maintain the same speed. If I wanted to speed up, so to finish this episode off completely, I'm going to actually speed up. And as I speed up, I'm going to trim down. There we go. I've now trimmed down. We're at 2,600. We are climbing a little bit. I'm not trimming fast enough here. But there we go. We're now at a new speed, and we've just retrimmed for the new speed. There we go. We're happily trimmed now for what seems to be around 130 knots or so we're accelerating to. 125 knots. And we're happy as a clam. Incidentally, why are clams happy? I don't know. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this lesson, and I hope you learnt about flying an aircraft and trimming it correctly. And hopefully that has really helped you guys out. If it did, thumbs up, like the video, comment, subscribe, and do support me on Patreon. Link to that is in the description box below. Your fuel level is critically low in the selected tank. Yes, don't worry about that. I don't know what happened there. That was a mistake. Don't do what I just did. That was an absolute mistake. Absolute error. That's because I wasn't looking at what I was doing. I will regain control of this aircraft momentarily. But yeah, do tune in for further tutorials. Okay, something's gone very wrong. I think this is maybe a bug. So I will sort that out anyway. There we go. Perfect. Okay. So do tune in for more tutorials. Next one, we're going to be learning about turning an aircraft, and we're going to be learning a little bit maybe about circuits, and we might even try landing an aircraft. But I think first of all we're going to learn about turning an aircraft, which should be very, very important. And then from there we're going to move on to, like I said, circuit training. Our first landing, we'll learn about the PAPI lights, and then we'll start learning about flying navigation, VOR to VOR. We'll learn about the ILS system, we'll learn about radio navigation, all that kind of stuff. So do tune in for all of that. And like I was saying before, I had a fuel issue. Do support me on Patreon. Link to that is in the description box below. I'd massively appreciate your support. And the £5 reward or $5 reward will give you access to my Discord channel, where you can ask me questions and talk and give me suggestions. Tell me what you want to see, and that way I can cater for you guys better, create presentations, stuff like that for you guys to be able to access. Let me trim this aircraft to finish this episode. That looks trimmed to me, or trimmed enough. Thank you very much for watching once again, and I will see you guys in another lesson of the ground up advanced flight tutorials.